This is my story about a teacher named Mrs. Silva. And Mrs. Silva wants to implement constructivist teaching strategies in her classroom. So this is about her long day in implementing these strategies to help her students learn. So Mrs. Silva, she was a passionate teacher who wanted to actively engage her sixth grade class. And she wanted to help engage and motivate her students by making them take a more active role in their learning process. So she wants to she's planned on utilize a lot of different interactive teaching strategies to create meaningful contexts that help students construct knowledge from these experiences and teach these higher order thinking skills. So for her lesson one day, she wanted her students to develop a deeper understanding of critical thinking skills when thinking about where a food comes from and what's in it. So she planned on activities where students can learn about different corn-derived ingredients, as well as evaluate and analyze information from film, research, and reading nutritional labels, as well as reflect and make arguments based on the information that they learned. So lots of critical thinking going on. She began this activity, by building from prior knowledge and showing the class an image of a cheeseburger, French fries, and a milkshake. And then asking her students what these three foods have in common. Spoiler alert, they all have corn. So after the students reflected and shared their ideas, she explained that they're all made of corn, and she also showed pictures of all the many foods that are available in the grocery store that also contain corn. So building on this prior knowledge is drawing from past experiences. I don't know what happened there. Drawing on past experiences and showing these familiar visuals of foods that they see every day helps to build this prior knowledge. So these are foods that you're very familiar with, but they all have corn ingredients. To work on problem solving, she then handed out a list of corn-derived ingredients, posing the question, what kinds of food typically contain these ingredients derived from corn? So Mrs. Silva designated each table a research group and had them examine the food labels that they had brought in for these corn-based ingredients. So they're problem solving by looking at all these different weird ingredients with weird names and figuring out what foods contain these ingredients and thinking, are these ingredients healthy? And why do they have different names? And how are they all corn-based ingredients? Mrs. Silva also implemented collaboration by having the students work in these groups to determine the most common corn-based ingredients that they found from the labels, and had each group state their findings to the class after creating a nice visual chart. So lots of group work and collaboration. Another strategy is that Mrs. Silva wanted to create a meaningful context for the activity to emphasize her teaching, but by providing a real-world setting instead of just this abstract instruction out of context. And because she couldn't take them on a field trip to a corn processing plant, she decided to show them a very informational, fantastic clip from a movie documentary called Food Inc. about the industrial production of corn. This was providing case-based learning and meaningful context. So all of this collaborative learning involves communication between the students and the groups. So she had the groups talk a lot and discuss how they felt about the idea that corn is hiding in these foods, often behind different names. And she had them also discuss how frequently they read nutrition labels on the foods they eat, as well as, do people even have the right to know what's in their food? And after this discussion, Mrs. Silva had all the students individually write an argument piece about whether or not people have the right to know what's in their food, supporting their point of view with reasons and information that they learned. So Mrs. Silva started to think about transfer of learning, and she knows her students will benefit from this near transfer, that is, transferring these persuasive writing skills to other classes and subjects later on. She knows this will be not be the last time that she writes an argument essay. They will be writing that well into college. Also, Mrs. Silva wanted to implement explicit teaching. This explicit teaching can be applied, can apply what they learned to other parts of their lives. So after they wrote this argument essay, the teacher had the groups talk about what they could use these persuasive writing skills that they used in the future, maybe to convince someone to hire them for a job. Eventually, these students will be interviewing for jobs in high school, possibly. Now, Mrs. Silva had to think about a far transfer, and that's harder, right? So it was finally lunchtime, and the students needed a break after all that critical thinking, and Mrs. Silva had to set up her new lesson on percentages. So she hopes for the students to create a far transfer of learning percentages and apply it to the outside world, like when they're shopping and having to determine a discount on a sale. Mrs. Silva had already worked a lot with her students on fractions to get to learning percentages. And the students, all students, have trouble learning fractions. I know I did. And Mrs. Silva really felt that using analogies and metaphors helped to teach these abstract concepts. And she used and loved the classic analogy of pizza slices to teach her students. And that visual really helped her students understand. Mrs. Silva had one more transfer of learning strategy up her sleeve. And after her history lesson on the civil rights movement, she asked her students to think about what elements are needed to create a successful social change in human rights movements. And then she had them research different historical movements. And she knew that this generalizing broader principles from the specific civil rights movement helped apply their learning from the micro to the macro. Whew, that Mrs. Silva, she's so passionate. She's passionate about conservation too, and she wanted her students to understand the problems faced by endangered species globally. So she taught them about the Endangered Species Act and everything. But she felt like her students needed to actively participate in the learning experience to really acquire knowledge through cooperative education. She decided for a field trip, and she decided to partner with the local zoo and have the students immersed and physically active in learning about endangered animals and what is immediately threatening them. So Mrs. Silva had heard about situated learning and wanted her students to be actively involved in addressing real-world problems. Well, this is a real-world problem. So she assigned different endangered animals to the students and the zookeepers that handle them to different groups to gather information and data on their animals, including what conservation efforts are being done, that they'll later include in a research paper. So this is happening, and Mrs. Silva was happy watching her students acquire this knowledge situationally because she knows that they're constructing knowledge from these experiences that are being brought to them hands-on. And she's happy that they're being challenged to use their critical thinking skills, because prior to this, she had them brainstorm questions to ask the zookeepers about what they can do to help, specific questions about their animals, as well as what their duties are as a zookeeper. And the zookeepers had them help with their activities, immersing them in the work. So because of all of these wonderful strategies, Mrs. Silva's students became successful from this social interaction with her groups and with the community in the zoo, because she knew learning is a result of a learning process taking place through these relationships between people and connecting these experiences. And by being immersed in this zoo community, as well as this global community and their efforts to protect these endangered species, the students unintentionally become connected and learn the virtue of stewardship, which is really